What's up guys, I'm randomfrankp. Really pumped to see more of these new small form factor PC cases coming out. And today we're going to be reviewing the brand new Fractal Era ITX. So with the Era ITX, it's a 16-liter chassis, does a really good job of blending, I'd say, minimal and classy in a small form factor PC case. They are available in 5 different colors. This one in particular is the titanium gray and walnut. Oh yes, that top panel is actually a removable walnut accented piece that magnetically attaches to the frame and adds a bit of extra eye candy, and something you don't really see on a PC. More on this in a minute though. In terms of size, the Era ITX comes in at 310mm tall, 166mm wide, and 325mm long. And I can say right now, it's definitely smaller than it appears on camera, because when I first unboxed it, it was just much smaller than I thought from seeing the initial press images. But in terms of getting into the actual build, we don't have any thumb screws for the aluminum side panels, which is always nice to see. They're kept into place by these push-to-lock pins, which makes them really easy to remove, but also so it stays secure when it's put back into place. Both of these side panels do have these staggered cutouts or heat dissipation. They're angled sort of near the back side of the case with an internal dust filter. And for the bottom of the case, we do have these side vents, but no actual bottom of the case exhaust or intake, which is why they have it sitting straight on a desk surface instead of, propped up an inch or so with feet. You can also see the subtle curve near the top of the case where it's designed to kind of, bow outward, which is just to help the heat kind of expel there out and around that top panel with that little gap in between, so it just vents out. And like I mentioned before, the top panel is magnetic. Removing that reveals a dust filter that is also magnetic. But inside the box is an additional secondary top panel, which is mesh. That just pops right on as well. This is gonna be more favoring for, better thermals. And then once both are removed, you have access for mounting a radiator. We will be testing thermals for each of the side panels coming up in a bit. But for the walnut finish, this is actually a composite core with walnut veneer on all sides. And this is so, versus regular wood, over time when it comes to humidity and temperature, this won't warp like usual wood. So back into the build process, before you start, you actually have to remove the front SSD drive bracket and the PSU bracket on the top right, which are held on by 12 screws in total. The SSD bracket can hold up to 2 SSDs, and the power supply bracket actually does have a mounting slot for a 3.5-inch drive, but you can also hold 2 more SSDs in there as well. I'm gonna be removing both the SSD and 3.5-inch drive completely from the build because I'm just using 2 NVMEs, but that's just me. But both do need to be removed before building. Now, one of the more interesting features to a small form factor case like this is its power supply compatibility. It supports ATX, SFXL, and SFX power supplies inside. I'm gonna be using an SF600 from Corsair, which is modular. And oddly, 2 of my PSU screws that came with the case weren't threaded. The top mounted PSU does include an internal routed power cable, and in addition to your usual I/O cables, we have support for USB-C, but my motherboard does not return the favor, unfortunately. Speaking of which, in addition to that, we have an illuminated power button, 2 USB 3.0s, and a headphone jack all on the front. Then once you're done building and everything is installed, we can talk compatibility and size limits, some of the more important stuff, which depending on your hardware can either be a good or a bad thing, because it's not all picture perfect, even when meeting their limitations. You can see here we have a decently sized graphics card with the Gigabyte GTX 1080 Ti, and up top mounted is a 240mm AIO, something you don't usually see in an ITX case. So for the GPU, you can fit a 2-slot card up to 295mm in length and 47mm tall max. But you can see on the right side where our power supply cables are coming down, it does press up a bit against the top of the GPU. So you're gonna have to try to route them and bend them behind the backside if possible. It is definitely a tight fit, so those cables might be giving you some grief. You might be saying, well, just move the power supply up a bit. But you can't really, because even moving it up 1 slot to the next screw had the actual power cable jammed into my fan from the AIO. But for the cooling compatibility, you can fit, like I have, a 240mm radiator with a max width of 125mm and 67mm in height. Or you could do a 120mm rad or 2 120mm fans up top. You get the idea. But another slight issue I ran into was the loop from my Asus Ryu was pressing right up against the included 80mm exhaust fan, which was obviously slowing it down a bit. So I had to really just bend those cables out so it just touched the side of the fan. And since there isn't much room as it is for these loops that are pretty stiff, it just provided another obstacle. Then another thing I'll caution you of is on the backside, make sure you have your cable management down pat, because there is virtually zero give, zero space for any cables to be unruly, because that back panel does lock right into the frame. And as you can see, we really don't have much of any clearance here. So the back panel would be just completely bowing out if a cable were just lying stray. So as we roll into thermals, I'll go over my hardware, even though it's pointless to have RGB and stuff on the inside since there's no tempered glass on the sides, we won't see inside, but that's okay. I have an Intel i7 8700K with the ASUS Ryo 240 AIO, 16 gigs of Corsair Vengeance Pro RGB RAM on an Asus B360i motherboard, and the Gigabyte GTX 1080 Ti, which altogether for, being inside a small case like this is pretty beefy. And just, man, that dark silver and walnut accent I think looks so good. So with a small case like this, obviously thermals are important, something you should be aware of. And I did a 10-minute stress test in Furmark with kind of 8 different results, but I ran those tests 5 times, and then averaged out between those 5 tests for the 8 results. And I ran it under load and idle for both the walnut top finish and the mesh panel to see the differences between the two. And as you'd expect, the wooden panel is gonna, choke it a bit more. The mesh does give you the better results because there's more just room for the air to vent out. But the main difference came under load because at idle, the wood panel had the CPU at 31 degrees Celsius and the GPU at 26 degrees Celsius. Then for the mesh, not too different at 30 and 23. But yes, under load when the PC is fully going 100%, that's where most of the benefits are gonna come from that mesh panel. We saw an 8-degree difference from our CPU and a 7-degree difference for our graphics card. So the Ryo 240 with those two 120mm fans pushing the heat, outward up top did seem to perform pretty well. But do keep in mind, these are just my results from my hardware and components inside here. Not everyone's gonna be using the same CPU with the Ryo 240 cooler. You could use a smaller one, just internal fans, an air cooler, that kind of stuff. Now also for compatibility, Fractal said that you can use 2 120mm fans on the bottom of the case if you have a 1-slot graphics card, which will help obviously push more heat from the GPU outward on the side of the vents, but not everybody's gonna be using a 1-slot GPU. And the last thing you're probably all wondering about is the price, and the Era ITX comes in at $160 MSRP, which is definitely pricey, possibly too pricey. I know when I first saw this, I was thinking, all right, maybe $99, that $100 price point, a sweet spot for a nice looking ITX case like this. And they said $160, and I was like, damn. That might prevent this from taking off like it should in this new wave of the ITX craze and stuff. And, it's a great case altogether. I love the end results. Thermals aren't too bad, but as you saw, there are some annoyances when building. Removing all those brackets and drives before you even start to build was kind of annoying. The lack of clearance on the backside for cable management was a bummer. Some of the limitations I showed you with like the power supply cables butting right up against the GPU, which was kind of pushing it down into the bottom of the case. And I do really wish instead of just having this sit on the desk, they would have had it propped up a bit with like feet or something like that, an inch or so we could have an additional filter on the bottom that would just also help with heat. Don't really see why that wasn't a thing. But altogether, for $160, if you want this really, minimal, classy looking small form factor case that has a pretty small footprint on your desktop, it's gonna cost you a bit. But yeah, guys, that'll wrap it up for my review. I just punched it. That'll wrap it up for my review of the Fractal Era ITX. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, give this video a big thumbs up to show your support. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at randomfrankp. And last, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. I hope you all enjoyed. Have a good day.